right, everybody. Good morning. The boss in the back tells me we're ready to get started, so I'm going to take it away if that's okay with you. My name is Melissa Ziobro. I am the Director of Public History at Monmouth University. I'm also the curator of the university's Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music. Yeah, we can talk about that later if you'd like, sure. But prior to that, I have the dubious distinction of being the last command historian at Fort Monmouth prior to the base's tragic closure. And that ties into why I am here speaking to you about the Hello Girls today. So bear with me for just a moment, because whenever I have a captive audience, I have to spend a moment singing the praises of Fort Monmouth and the amazing men and women, military and civilian, who served there. So normally I'm not speaking to a military audience. So you probably know more of the Fort Monmouth story and the rest of the story I'm going to tell today than my usual audience might. But if you're not familiar with Fort Monmouth, this military base, not far from here, stood up during World War I. It was a Signal Corps base. So the Signal Corps is the branch of the Army charged with all manner of military communications, starts in the Civil War era. So the base trained Signal Corps soldiers for World War I and also had laboratories working on cutting edge technologies like air-to-ground radio. Although the site was supposed to be temporary, it wound up outliving the war. The chief signal officer is going to authorize the purchase of the land. It will go from being called Camp Little Silver to Camp Alfred Vale to finally Fort Monmouth in 1925. And it will be known for many, many years as the home of the Signal Corps. The base remains open until 2011, when it is closed during one of the Department of Defense's base realignment and closure rounds. So if anybody is interested in more history about Fort Monmouth, and you should be, these are some books that are available. I actually have a new book, largely based on oral histories with men and women who served at the fort, coming out in May. So I always have to give that plug when I have a captive audience, because I don't want this important New Jersey, national, international history to be lost. So how does this tie into the topic at hand today, the Hello Girls? I always think it's interesting to hear why people are researching, writing, and lecturing on the topics that they are. And I started at Fort Monmouth in March of 2004, so 20 years ago this month. It was my first big person job out of college, right? And I had been trained how to be a historian, but I didn't know anything about the Signal Corps, a little about the Army. My dad is a proud veteran. I didn't know anything about the Signal Corps. So, right, you take a crash course. You start diving in and reading everything you can about the subject at hand. And as I am getting this crash course in Signal Corps history, I come across the story of the Hello Girls. I had never heard of them. I was a lifelong history lover, like from the time I was in grade school, reading everything I could about history. I was a history major. I'd studied history for 4 years as an undergrad. Never heard of the Hello Girls. And so I was like, oh, this is interesting. And so since that period in 2004, I've been telling the story of the Hello Girls every opportunity I get. You could find some things in 2004 written about the Hello Girls, but it was usually things produced by the military, right? So this is by the Signal Corps Museum. This was a Center of Military History book by Rebecca Robbins Rains on the Signal Corps, and it, of course, covered the Hello Girls. But there wasn't a lot of stuff out there popularly available. That started to change a little bit. The Hello Girls got a little more coverage with the World War I centennial years, when everybody's doing a lot more research into aspects of the Great War. And so recently, this past few years, we've had more and more come out on the women in popular media. So, for example, we've got Grace Banker and the Hello Girls Answer the Call. This is a graphic history geared towards young readers, but good for everybody. On Amazon Prime, there's a wonderful documentary, The Hello Girls, talking about their quest for veteran status. There's even some historical fiction, if that's what you're into, featuring the Hello Girls. I've read it. I loved it. I'm not ashamed. And then the most serious in-depth monograph about the Hello Girls to be produced is just this tremendous book by Elizabeth Cobbs. So if you're interested in anything you hear today, I recommend you check these out. Okay. So with all of that context, I've got to forgive me. I've been teaching since 2007. You got to give students a lot of scaffolding, right? So with all of that background and all of that context, let's dive into the actual story. Who are these Hello Girls? So prior to World War I, the U.S. military only occasionally used women, and usually in what it considered gender appropriate roles. For example, you would have civilian women, often known as camp followers, who cooked and mended for men in the periods of the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, much as they would have been expected to do for men in times of peace. You do have some women dress as men in order to serve, but that's relatively rare. We do also see women used as spies, couriers, but again, pretty rare. Women do act as nurses during the American Revolution and Civil Wars, but there's a lot of concern about the close contact with males' bodies that's going to require. And the Army Nurse Corps does not become a part of the medical department until 1901. The Corps becomes a military organization at that time, but nurses do not have the same rank, pay, or benefits equal to that offered to male soldiers with similar backgrounds doing similar work. Because there's all of this anxiety about how equating women's work with men's work would question men's superiority. Of course, restrictions on the employment of women pervaded the economic sector, right? The civilian economic sector during this time as well. That's just how the world was. But the needs of the military during World War I are going to be so great that the military gets a little more creative. The Marines are going to allow roughly 300 women to serve as contracted administrative clerks. The Navy's going to list some 11,000 women by December of 1918. They almost all serve stateside, and they serve various purposes, secretarial, but some of them become translators, fingerprint experts, camouflage experts, etc. And then the Army has the Signal Corps Female Telephone Operators Unit, commonly called the Hello Girls. So how does this start? General John Pershing, who is the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, has real concerns about how the Army is going to communicate, especially across the massive Western Front. He knows that telephone switchboards are going to be key, but there is a shortage of telephone switchboard operators generally, and especially ones who can speak both English and French so that we can communicate with our allies. I mean, keep in mind, when the United States gets into World War I in April of 1917, the Army is roughly 200,000 strong. That is never going to make a difference in this war. So we very quickly have to raise an enormous army. We wind up raising an army of about 4 million, but you got to raise this army. It's very hectic. We are really behind the 8 ball as we get into this war. So several officers in the Army Signal Corps suggest that the Army recruit bilingual American women from the commercial telephone companies to help with that problem. In the civilian world, most telephone switchboard operators were women. That was seen as women's work, but it was good work for women. That was kind of like the higher end of the career ladder that women would aspire to. They were well paid, they were respected. So the American civilian women know how to do this work. You wouldn't have to spend time training them. You wouldn't have to take bodies out of the ranks, which is of concern. This 1910 article just points out how, the overwhelming percentage of female telephone operators in the United States are unwed women. And that's the target pool that the Signal Corps is suggesting the Army go after. So Colonel Parker Hitt, who's chief signal officer for the U.S. First Army, he explains, quote, an Army telephone central would have to have American women operators to be a success. Our experience in Paris with the untrained and undisciplined English-speaking French women operators and experience elsewhere with the willing but untrained men operators was disastrous, right? So before they bring in the American civilian women, their options are use French ladies. They don't feel they can control them enough, right? That's a wild card. And then trying to train men how to do the work. But it's hard. If you take somebody off their farm and make them a soldier and then try to make them a switchboard operator also, that's hard work. And so Pershing is ultimately going to agree with the Signal Corps officers. And there's a cable in which he says, quote, on account of the great difficulty of obtaining properly qualified men, request organization and dispatch to France a force of women operators, all speaking French and English equally well. So calls go out to the recruiting stations in newspapers across the country. Hello, girls wanted. Young women of America, attention. Here's an opportunity to serve your country in France with General Pershing's expeditionary force. And the articles go on, trying to convince women to apply for this opportunity. There are reports that some 7,000 women apply. The response is overwhelming. Ultimately, they wind up using roughly 225 women. The women were going to earn the same pay as male soldiers doing the same work. This is a little bit of a sticking point, causes a little bit of tensions between the Army nurses and the hello girls, actually. What I find interesting about the wages is that many of these women, because it was so competitive, many of the women who get selected had a lot of seniority in their civilian careers, were at the higher end of the pay scale. Many of these women wind up taking a pay cut to join the Army. They do this because they want to serve their country. It's not a path to upward mobility for them. They want to serve their country. So the women that are selected complete much of their Signal Corps training at Camp Franklin, now part of Fort George G. Meade in Maryland. After training, the women have to purchase regulation uniforms, complete with all of the, U.S. crests and insignia. They get dog tags, which don't look like dog tags today, but the same dog tags that the soldiers were being issued in World War I. And they have various other armbands and patches that designate their rank, etc. This is just an article from an old Fort Monmouth newspaper that kind of shows you the evolution of women's uniforms. I have to laugh because she's wearing a Hello Girls uniform on the end, but it would have been down to the floor. Like, she's far, far too tall for that uniform. I don't know. So their skirts would have come all the way down. I love this description of the Hello Girls from a contemporary newspaper. They will wear a uniform prescribed by the War College and will say farewell to all other kinds of dresses from the day they start work until it's all over there. You can also kind of see the uniforms here. Sometimes our digitized newspapers aren't as clear as we would like, but I love the headline, Hello Girls here in real Army duds. But were these women soldiers? It all happened so quickly that things get a little murky. The initial language used in the recruiting seemed to indicate that they would be enlisting, that they would be female soldiers. The women and the press certainly believed that. There's an article, in this newspaper talking about how they're wearing their Army duds. Lots of newspapers talking about the women soldiers, the women being the first to serve. One Hello Girl writing about her service after the war talks about how they were treated just like the male soldiers. At this point in this excerpt I'm going to read you, the Hello Girls are in Hoboken waiting to get on a troop ship. That was a major port of embarkation. They're there with the men waiting to get on a troop ship and deploy. And she talks about how we had to hop out of bed at 7 a.m. and go through what we call the pajama drill in the cold, bare room. Making a military person out of a frivolous girl is an interesting and difficult evolution. And then she goes on to talk about, how they finally get their orders and they get on the ship and they still have to train and drill on the ship, just like the men do, etc. In Elizabeth Cobb's fine book, she talks about how many of the women bobbed their hair on the way over, just so it would be easier, so it would be out of the way, so they wouldn't have to worry about it. And when they disembarked, the male soldiers serenaded them with this song. Good morning, Lady Telephone, with your hair cut short as mine. Good morning, Mrs. Telephone, you're surely looking fine. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. If the engineers don't get you, the Signal Corps must. Good morning, Lady Telephone. I'll love you till the end of time. Now, while the women are being trained and deploying, as I said, this is happening rather quickly, somewhere in the bowels of a building in Washington, D.C., the Army's legal counsel circulates an internal memorandum that says these women will be civilian employees of the Signal Corps and will have the privileges and allowances prescribed or hereafter prescribed by Army nurses, and it goes on in legalese. But the women's status remains muddy. The women don't know this, though. They're deployed. They're gone. And they think that they have enlisted in the military. So we're going to return to this. The first operators, though, arrive in Europe in March of 1918 under the leadership of Grace Banker, Jersey girl from Passaic, New Jersey, right? If we got a hard job that we need done, we want a Jersey girl at the helm. So this is Chief Operator Grace Banker here. And this is a photo of some of the first operators in France. So members of the Signal Corps Female Telephone Operators Unit are soon operating telephones in exchanges, all across the American Expeditionary Force. Sometimes they get quite close to the battlefield. I would just note that this is from the World War I Centennial Commission's page. In addition to Grace Banker, we had 3 other Hello Girls from New Jersey, Marie, Suzanne, and Louisette. So the women get over there and people kind of act surprised at first that this experiment is working out. This article says, our Signal Corps girls give no trouble, but do fine work, go on time, and take care of themselves. Like, oh, gee, do they really? And then this is really interesting because the women want to get as close to the action as possible where they feel they can be the most useful. But the men, for all that the Signal Corps men were open, many of them, to the idea of employing women, getting them closer and closer to the actual front is of concern. And so you can see this article talks about how the telephone girls wanted to go to the front. They made a formal petition and it was granted as much as is compatible with chivalry. So there was this tension. While they're here, they're great, but is it safe to let them closer to the front where we need them? I keep saying that they're competent, that they're good at their work. It reportedly took the average male operator 60 seconds to connect a call, while a woman could do it in 10. So for a lot of reasons, right? The women had been doing this for years and years and years. There's also some discussion about like women's tiny fingers being better, but I think it's the experience. I think it's the experience here, right? During the New Sargon offensive, a team of telephone operators personally accompanied Pershing. You can see him here with his telephone contingent, maintaining communications for him around the clock. This was critical work that could save lives. Each of these operators near the front line could manage some 50 phone lines connected to the Army's operations section. Now, I have some ladies in the audience who said they had worked for AT&T, and you may have seen the huge switchboards. These are enormous switchboards. And it's hard work. They're unplugging jacks. They're going up. They're going over. It's physically demanding work. It's stressful work. But the women really, really excelled. As one of the operators recalled, quote, every order for an infantry advance, a barrage preparatory to the taking of a new objective. In fact, every troop movement came over our fighting lines, as we called them. And as I said, that's Pershing reviewing his female troops. The operators often lived and worked in very Spartan conditions. This was not like a Paris vacation for them. They were issued gas masks and steel helmets, which you can see there. They regularly wrote about how they were being awakened by air raids. They could see the flash and feel the rumble from the big guns. They would sometimes work 48-hour shifts at the front before being rotated to the back, where they're just trying to snatch, little sleep where they can. The women were not just very effective. Their presence was also thought to improve morale, which I find very interesting. Whenever I'm doing history, I'm always looking for the human aspects in addition to the data. And I find this so interesting. Again and again, you find the men talking about how much they trust the women, how they're glad they have female telephone operators, and just how they liked seeing them, hearing them. It was a comfort to them, which I think we should not discount either. This is a letter, a friend found it at a yard sale, and it's a soldier writing home, and he talks about how we've got some telephone girls, and now I hope we can have a dance. Like, they're in the middle of the war. It's horrific. They're away from home, but the idea of having a dance was interesting. This article says, American officers have been pleasantly surprised when taking up the telephone number to hear the familiar number, please, or lines busy instead of the French equivalent. There are men who are momentarily moved to tears when they hear an American woman's voice on the other end, only because it just automatically transports them to their wife or their mom. And I think that is really, really interesting. Although the women were kind of lost to history for a bit, they were very well known and beloved at the time. This is a YWCA poster, Back Our Girls, over there. And if you look, she's at the switchboard. What's happening right outside her window? The battle is right there. You can see the smoke. You can see the soldiers. You can see the weapons, right? So there was this recognition that the women were right in the thick of it. They are not, as I said, in Paris having a vacation. The women were regularly covered in newspaper articles. This is one from Alaska talking about American hello girls ready for service over there. This one, brave girl soldiers of the switchboard. This one, the title is cut off, but it's called Applied Patriotism. And I would point out, again, she is centered right in the middle of the action. So there's an awareness of that. This is an Asbury Park Press newspaper article. And it talks about how, there were women who deployed as volunteers, whether they were working for the Red Cross or various other agencies. And this woman was coming back to New Jersey to talk about her volunteer work in France. And she talks of the splendid work being done by the Signal Corps girls, Uncle Sam's Hello Girls. This is an article post-war, 1926, but they're talking about giving away awards to female heroines of the Great War. And it says, again, the telephone girls were said to have done the bravest work. So I think that's really interesting, too, that the women were really well known at the time, and they were quite popular. This is an interesting contrast, and we don't have time to go into it too much, but my master's thesis focused on women in World War II. And there is tremendous anxiety over using women during that war. And there's a smear campaign against women, so that questioning their morals, questioning everything about them. The smear campaign is so intense that the government, the military, even Eleanor Roosevelt gets involved because they fear that it's a Nazi-inspired effort to undermine the American war effort by discouraging women from getting involved in the war. So it's interesting. We don't see that type of negative blowback against the Hello Girls it could be for a number of reasons, because they are much smaller in number, because they're in and then the war ends so relatively quickly. But I think it's a really interesting thing to consider. In any event, this service is not without its dangers. Women are often quite close to the battlefield, and we all know that, people die in the service of their country from other reasons, not necessarily related to combat. We do have 2 Hello girls who die in France of illness while in the service of the United States. You can see here Inez Crittenden's, military grave marker. When the women deployed, they had to fill out, paperwork just like the men did, saying what was to happen to their remains if they were killed overseas, who was their next of kin, right? Because from even before they departed, there was the recognition that they might not return home. I find this interesting too. It was Inez Crittenden and Cora Bartlett who die over there. And when Cora's death is announced, it's listed with the men, right? She's not in a separate section for ladies who are helping us. She is listed with the soldiers. So again, we'll come back to this. Were they soldiers or not? As the war draws to a close, military leadership did not immediately forget the role that women played. 2 days after the armistice, the chief signal officer of the First Army states in his official report that, quote, a large part of the success of the communications of this army is due to a competent staff of women operators. 30 of the operators received special commendations, and chief operator Grace Banker even gets the Distinguished Service Medal. There were 16,000 Signal Corps officers who could have got that medal. Grace Banker is one of 18 to do so. This is just an article about her winning the medal. It talks about how she got the Distinguished Service Medal for exceedingly meritorious and distinguished service and untiring devotion to her duties under trying conditions. The press and the public remain largely aware of, and as I said, supportive of the women. It says it is difficult for us to realize the scope of the work that has been done and is still being accomplished by the telephone operators in France. This was an article from 1919. The Hello Girls are some of the last uniformed service members to come home. People start getting discharged right away. Men, you don't need fighting men anymore. Sure, they can go home. Okay. But the Signal Corps' Hello Girls were needed to facilitate communications for all of the peace negotiations, the Paris Peace Conference. Some go to Germany to assist occupation forces there. So they're actually some of the last women, some of the last soldiers, who get to come home. And the women remain popular, even post-war. When Grace gets married, it's like a big deal, and paparazzi are like all over her wedding. So I said that women are some of the last American service members to get to come home. I'm always looking for the human interest stories. They get to let their hair down and have a little more fun after the armistice. And I find that interesting too. This tells about the Hello Girls having a dance with General Pershing. It says, wonder of wonders, General Pershing asked us all to tea at his chateau. We were taken there in limousines. And the general said, let's take up the rug and have a little music. The general danced with mostly all the guests. And believe me, he's a wonderful dancer, right? So, think about it. This is after what they had been through. The fact that they now get to celebrate their victory, enjoy this success a little bit is I think wonderful, because the world was very limiting for women back then. The fact that these women were having an adventure abroad was really a marvel that really didn't happen, especially for women of their class versus, fabulously wealthy women. This is another interesting example. It talks about, this is how, so this married couple, we're not supposed to get married, but a Hello Girl gets married to a soldier after the armistice, and they want to go home together. but they are both told, no, you will each get your respective discharge orders when you get them. You don't just get to go home together now. Interesting. Again, tuck that away, because if the woman was a civilian, she would have been able to go home whenever she wanted, one assumes, right? But they're both told, no, you will go home when you get your discharge orders. You can go home. So these young lovers, they're like, who can we enlist to help us? Who has the most clout around here? And they wind up going to White House Social Secretary Edith Helm, who is there, with the president's contingent. And they're like, okay, she knows the president. Surely she can pull some strings for us. And so she goes to the new husband's commander and she says, come on, they're married. Don't you have any soft spot in your heart for young love? And he says, madam, I have none. I have just secured a divorce from my wife and I am well rid of her. So no, he did not have sympathy for the young lovers. This is another example. Millicent writes of her great adventure, and she talks about how she gets to go to one of these parties and she gets to dance with the Prince of Wales. And she says, yeah, he was all right for a prince, but I liked the American way of dancing the best, right? So after all these women had been through, I love that they get to have these lighter experiences. Because again, I said the world was very limiting for women, even to include the fact that these women who deployed for the United States did not have the right to vote. Women had been trying for generations at this point to get the vote unsuccessfully. So these women raised their hands. Some of them took a pay cut, went to war, were in danger to die. They didn't even have the right to vote. And so most historians agree that is women's successful support of World War I that winds up ultimately, swaying the American public and the American government to support women's suffrage. I mean, many women are willing to point it out. This picket sign says, Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. And so ultimately, women then do wind up getting the right to vote. As this cartoon from the period says, if you are good enough for war, you are good enough to vote. And so women will shortly thereafter, after the end of the war, get the right to vote. Back to the Hello Girls. So they are some of the last uniformed service members to make their way home. When they get here, they find that they are denied veterans status. They are told that they were civilian employees of the Army. And this perplexes the women because they were required to wear their uniforms properly at all times with all their insignia. They were sworn in to the service. They were constantly reminded that they had to follow all Army regulations. They were constantly reminded that they were subject to court-martial. They couldn't come home whenever they felt like it. They had to wait for their discharge orders. So this is an affront to many of the women, but it's also going to deny them many concrete benefits. For example, hospitalization for any disabilities they may have suffered during the war, certain cash bonuses, certain soldiers' pensions, the right to have a flag on their coffin, certain different tax breaks. I mean, there are a lot of things that they are denied, benefits they are denied, in addition to just the injustice of it all. So there were men that came to the defense of the Hello Girls. For example, Chief Signal Officer George Squire here, to no avail. It just kind of gets lost in the shuffle in the aftermath of the war. And a lot of the women don't agitate actively like many soldiers. They come home and they want to put the war behind them. They're some traumatized from their experience. They just want to go back to work. Some of them are starting families. And so it kind of becomes a dead issue. This is an article that just talks about how we are a prosperous nation. The women who served in our time of need should not find us ungrateful, right? So kind of becomes a dead issue. For years, occasionally legislation would be introduced to Congress to correct this perceived injustice, but just kind of always gets buried in committee. There's one operator in particular who will not let it go, though. This is Merle Egan Anderson. She keeps up the fight for 50 years before finally getting legislation passed to give the operators veteran status. In Anderson's eyes, the evidence was overwhelming. She talks about how she was sworn in by the Adjutant General of the Montana National Guard. She wore a military uniform with Army buttons and Signal Corps insignia. She traveled to Europe on a troop ship with several thousand other troops. When she was injured, she was treated in a military hospital. As I said, they were all constantly reminded that they had to follow regulations, that they were subject to court order. She talks about how even when she is in the process of getting discharged, she has a question about her discharge orders, and she is told, quote, "Young lady, you are still in the Army and you will do as you are told," end quote. So it's not until President Jimmy Carter's administration that a bill is signed giving these women the veteran status that they had so long sought. Of course, unfortunately, few of the women are still around to know that they actually got that honor in 1979. A quick note, because this comes up sometimes, particularly like students will be like, why do they call them girls? That's so degrading. One might say that. I don't think it was necessarily meant as degrading. Telephone operators were called hello girls long before the Signal Corps Female Telephone Operators Unit. That's just what they were called. And we referred to the doughboys also. So I don't think it was meant as an insult in any way. That is my take. You can just see some, headlines here, hello girls being used. It was just the common parlance for a telephone operator. This just makes me laugh. This is an excerpt from someone who immigrates to the United States, and she has to explain, in the USA, they address you as girl, even if you are a grandmother. So, it was just the language that was used at the time. Just a bit of an epilogue here. Despite the official lag in recognition for the Hello Girls as veterans, when World War II comes around, right, because unfortunately the Great War is not, in fact, the war to end all wars, and we will rather quickly find ourselves embroiled in World War II, which is an even larger conflict requiring an even larger mobilization. So people who are advocating for the use of women in World War II will point to the women of World War I, like the Hello Girls, and say, see what an enormous success that was? Why are we even debating this? We need women now. And so there is this, as I mentioned earlier, tremendous hand-wringing during the World War II era about whether or not women should be allowed to serve and how. If you look at the congressional record, you see politicians literally saying things like, well, women generals will rush around the country dictating orders to male personnel and telling the commanding officers of posts how to run their business. The audacity. There's another quote I love. A politician says, well, who then will do the cooking, the washing, the mending, the humble home tasks to which every woman devotes herself? And these objections to women's service during World War II are bipartisan. Politicians on both sides of the aisle, as we're going into World War II, are fighting the use of women. But we know that ultimately, the Army will be the first of the services to enlist women in May of 1942, with first the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and then the Women's Army Corps. And then they are followed by the Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines. Some 350,000 women wind up serving in World War II, the bulk of them in the Army, as you see here. They serve at home and abroad. They serve in a wider variety of roles, though not technically in combat. They are often, right there providing aid, driving trucks, delivering food and ammunition. And women would not be dismissed following World War II as they were following World War I. The Women's Armed Forces Integration Act of July 1948 made women permanent participants in the military in both peace and war. This is some women with the Defense Secretary after the passage of the act in 1948. There are all these restrictions on women in the military that are only gradually lifted with time. For example, in 1975, President Ford signs a law allowing women to enter U.S. military academies. Pat Locke in the center here is one of the first 62 female graduates of West Point. The Women's Army Corps as a separate corps of the Army is finally disestablished in 1978. And since then, women in the Army have just continued to break down barriers over what jobs in the military they might do and whether or not they deserve to be there. When the draft ends in 1973, women represent just 2% of the enlisted forces and 8% of the officer corps. Today, those numbers are roughly 16% and 19%, which shows a significant increase over the past half century. So every success builds on those of an earlier generation, and I think the Signal Corps Hello Girls certainly played a big role in kicking down barriers, putting some cracks in that glass ceiling, whatever phrase you want to use. One final note before we wrap up this story, the Hello Girls are currently being considered for a Congressional Gold Medal. They've been being considered for a few years, and it just kind of keeps dying. But over 100 years after these women came home, there are still new people learning about their work and still new opportunities to honor their services and their sacrifice. If anyone uses QR codes, if you point your phone's camera at that QR code right there, it'll take you to the World War I Centennial Commission's website, where you can get more information on how to support the Congressional Gold Medal for the Hello Girls. Or later, you can just Google it. You'll be able to find the site pretty easily. Okay, and with that, I would be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. As the battles moved around Europe, did the switchboards, et cetera, all move around?
Yes. Yep.
Where is the grave site? Do you know in France? I'm going to France for about 2 weeks.
Oh, the exact location. Let me look it up and send it to you. I will make a note to send it to you.
The question I had was there any consideration of changing her marker to state that she wasn't a civilian?
I will look that up for you as well. I'm going to make you some notes. The American Battlefields Memorial Commission, did I get the acronym right? They'll have all the information on their website, but I'll look it up for you also. Okay, well, thank you for your time. Thank you for letting me share this story with you. And make sure you look around the museum if you're not familiar, because Andrew and Carol and Duncan and all of the volunteers do such a tremendous job here. There's really some wonderful things to see. Thank you so much.
Thank you.